Okay, thank you very much. And it looks like you'll drive the slides, so thank you. I just want to start out by saying we appreciate the opportunity to come in and share a little bit about the work of ISO New England. Our organization is based in Western Massachusetts, and I'll talk briefly about some of our major responsibilities and then talk about how we are planning for the development of large loads, and I'll explain what that means here in New England. I'd be happy to take questions along the way, but I'll take any cues from the chair in terms of how we manage the time. So next slide, please.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. So ISO New England has responsibility for three primary areas related to the bulk power system in New England. We operate the high voltage transmission network and coordinate with all of the electric transmission companies in the region. You can think of the ISO as the air traffic control for the power system. Air traffic control wants to make sure that planes take off and land safely. Our job is to make sure that supply and demand for electricity are in a perfect balance for New England on a minute-to-minute basis. We operate the transmission system in an agreement with the transmission owners in New England. So I would just make it clear up front that ISO New England does not own transmission. We don't own generation. We are a service provider here in the region. Every power plant in New England that wants to connect to the grid and operate on a day-to-day basis does that through coordination with ISO New England. So we're making sure that the system in total operates reliably. And when we talk about operating the bulk power system, we manage the high voltage lines. So these are the larger lines and the larger poles, typically rated 115,000 volts and above. Most of the power in New England actually flows on the 345,000 volt lines or 345 kV. And you can think of that like the interstate network for delivering power across New England. So that's on the operation side. We've been doing this function for New England since 1997. The second responsibility we have is for administering wholesale electricity markets. And our customers in New England typically are power plants that are selling into the grid, suppliers who may be contracting with power plants in New England or outside of New England. And we provide a market platform for buyers and sellers at wholesale. Finally, the third area of responsibility, which we'll talk more about today, is the planning of the transmission system. We look out 5 to 10 years. We develop a forecast each year of the electricity needs for the 15 million people in New England. We look at that on a regional basis. We also looked at it on a state-by-state basis. And we need to make sure that the transmission system can support the forecasted demand for electricity. And of course, large loads would have an impact on the transmission system. We also oversee the interconnection of new resources. So if somebody wants to build a new power plant of any kind, as long as it's tied into the high voltage network, that is coordinated through ISO New England. So those are the three responsibilities we have. The I in ISO originally stood for the independent system operator. We do not have any financial interest in any companies that participate in the market. And we are regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC. So they oversee these three functions: operations, markets, and planning. Next slide, please. And this talks about some of the things that we don't do, just to distinguish between the wholesale side and the retail side. We do not have any connection to the retail customers in New England. That is under the jurisdiction of the state public utility commissions. I mentioned we don't own infrastructure or have financial interest in the companies. You will hear ISO New England talk from time to time about fuel infrastructure, but the only thing we actually operate is the electric transmission system. If a power plant is going to sell power into the New England market, they need to manage the acquisition and contracts for their fuel. If something needs to be built, whether it's new transmission or generation, that goes to the state siting agencies for approval. We approve the interconnection to the grid, but where things are located is up to the individual states. And finally, we do not have authority to plan which resources get built. So some people might advocate for certain technologies, whether it's nuclear or wind or gas, and ISO New England doesn't have an ability to plan on an integrated basis which types of resources get built. That is a decision that's made by companies that are investing capital in the region and by states that are expressing preferences for different types of technologies. Next slide, please. So when we talk about the ISO's planning responsibilities, I mentioned we do a forecast every year looking at the demand for electricity. For the past decade or so, the growth in electricity demand has essentially been flat. We have not seen year over year increases in demand. A lot of that is because of two developments. One is energy efficiency investments by the states and utilities has really brought down electricity consumption. And we've also seen more recently behind the meter solar. So if somebody puts a solar panel on the rooftop or a small array in their community, it doesn't really look like a source of power to ISO New England. It looks like a reduction in demand on the bulk power system because that customer is now being served by that solar array. So historically, we've done forecasting based on economic indicators and population estimates, but there are some types of loads that just sort of appear in large quantities, and they wouldn't necessarily be part of our normal forecasts. So we call those step loads, and we've indicated on this chart just a couple of types of loads that would contribute to demand growth in the region. So normally we're looking at growth of 1 to 2% perhaps per year. That would be pretty aggressive. But if you have a data center, which could be tens or hundreds of megawatts, that wouldn't show up in the normal forecast. So we've started to factor in a forecast for data centers. We are not anticipating crypto mining to happen here in New England, but it is a type of large load that we would be on the lookout for. There are very aggressive goals for electrification of both transportation and buildings for heating throughout New England. And so those could have significant impacts on future electricity demand. And then EV charging depots. I'm not talking about if you put an EV in your garage and you have a plug to connect that to your local circuit. We're talking about if there was a bus terminal with all electric buses. Those types of things wouldn't normally show up in our forecast. They are what we consider a large load or a step load. Next slide. So there's a couple of ways that we are preparing for these types of loads. And I would just say kind of upfront, we are not seeing these types of loads appear in New England currently. They certainly are a major development down in the Pennsylvania area around Virginia. Northern Virginia is Data Center Alley. And one of the reasons there's a lot of data center activity is most of the global internet traffic comes ashore in undersea cables that make landfall in the area around Virginia. And companies are creating data centers really right on top of that infrastructure. We don't have that up here in New England. We also, as you probably know, have pretty high electricity prices, so it's not an ideal place for most data centers to be located. However, there are expressions of interest in some smaller data centers, and so we've modified some of our planning processes to take into account that possibility. So first of all, in most cases, a data center would not come to ISO New England directly to connect. For the most part, they would go to the electric transmission companies in the region, or we call them the transmission owners, and they would be seeking to interconnect typically at the local distribution system. So the transmission owners are kind of our eyes and ears into the interest in developing those types of resources. Secondly, our team is in close coordination with state policymakers, legislators, utility regulators in each of the New England states to understand what types of incentives or programs might be in place that would affect the development of large loads. I'll give you an example, not necessarily from New Hampshire, but both Connecticut and Massachusetts have provided tax incentives for the development of data centers. And so those are on the books in Massachusetts and Connecticut. It hasn't necessarily resulted in a massive development of data centers, but it is one of the ways that the states could incent those types of resources. More recently, Massachusetts has provided some guidance to restrict some of that development, but I think the state's tax incentives really were geared around economic development for attracting data centers. I'm not sure that fully takes into consideration the impacts on the electric transmission system, however. And finally, we're doing research with our peer organizations. There are ISOs around the country, and we work with engineers who operate transmission systems nationally to understand what they are seeing and how they are accommodating these types of large loads in here in New England. Next slide, please. So I mentioned our forecast a couple of times. It's the technically it's called the capacity, energy, load, and transmission. And load is essentially the amount of electricity demand that is being served on the bulk power system. So currently in our forecast, we see very limited data center activity, but potential for growth. There's only a few projects that are in formal study, and it's under 300 megawatts. 300 megawatts would be very large for a town or a municipality, but it would be about the size of a small power plant here in New England. Just for a point of reference, the New England power grid peaks at about 25,000 megawatts in the summer. So adding 300 megawatts would certainly be manageable. But if we had massive deployment of data centers in states around the region, that would certainly be much more challenging. So the near-term impact we expect to be minimal before the 2027-28 timeframe. Our forecast, which does look out 10 years, we've started to make some assumptions based on early expressions of interest that the amount of impact to peak demand into the 2030s is really in the low hundreds of megawatts. And large loads, of course, would typically be consuming electricity around the clock. So we also think about how much energy they're consuming, not just sort of the capacity that's added to the system. And so those numbers are relatively small as well. Next slide. So there are a number of things that will influence the development of large loads around the country. Very recently, our regulator, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, issued an order. That order relates to large loads specifically, and it applied to all system operators like ISO New England across the country. In that process, this is based on direction that the U.S. Department of Energy and the Trump administration has given to FERC to ready the nation's transmission system for the development of large loads. And the large loads really are to support and enable AI activity in the U.S. And so they've put some pressure on FERC to come up with a way to streamline the process to enable large loads to connect into the system. ISO New England is required to submit a filing to the FERC in August. We are in the process of doing that. And just this week, we introduced a couple of statements about the types of elements that will be included in our filing to FERC. We've also requested an extension of the time to complete the filing. This was part of FERC's original plan that ISOs could request time, and that's to work with our stakeholders in the states to develop the filing here within the region. So we do expect by November the full filing will go into the FERC. We also submitted this week to our stakeholders a draft of a filing that talks about how we will manage resource adequacy as we see development of large loads in the region. Resource adequacy is a industry term essentially means, do you have enough resources tied into your system or accessible to the region to support the forecasted demand for electricity? So there are a couple of early statements. They are posted on our website, and if they're of interest to the group, we can certainly follow up and make those available. But in addition to any work we might be doing proactively in New England, we are under obligation to respond to orders from our regulator to put in place a longer-term plan to deal with large loads. There are also, looking on the right-hand side, there's a number of national conversations underway. State utility commissions are looking at this very closely. The National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, or NARUC, is watching the development of large loads, and they have an interest in the reliability of the electric system, so making sure we can serve the demand on the grid, but also equity issues in terms of what happens to the costs for normal everyday consumers if suddenly very large loads are added to the system. Who's going to pay for the resources needed to support them? Who's going to pay for the transmission system to support them? And those are questions that state regulators are looking at very closely. A number of industry groups are looking at the risks that are attached to having large loads added to the system. And as I mentioned earlier, the states have different priorities around this. If we think about the last 2 years, the state legislatures have considered a wide range of responses to potential data center activity, including moratorium. Maine, for example, has a new executive order that the governor signed that is creating a large load and data center advisory committee that has to produce a report on how they will address the development of large loads in Maine. So there's a lot of interest in this area, and we're trying to stay on top of that here at ISO New England. Next slide. I think that's the last slide. So Jen, I'll pause there and happy to take any questions.
John Newt here. So 30 years ago, there was a huge controversy about building new power lines in New Hampshire to bring down Hydro-Quebec power. So that did not happen. That was defeated. And yet we still have electricity right now. Where did this electricity come from that filled that gap? Did we turn Seabrook up to 11?
You broke up at the end, but I did hear there were proposals for bringing hydropower down from Quebec. We have done that. We are a importer of power as a region. Typically, about 5 to 10% of our electricity does come from Quebec. We have new transmission line that was recently energized that allows additional power to flow into New England from Quebec. But most of the generation over the past couple of decades has been natural gas fired generation.
Originally, I guess. That's okay. I'm happy. Yeah.
Yeah, we're still freezing. So I can stay with yeah. That's a SRBC for down here in the bottom right now. And turn okay. Folks online, I'm going to leave the meeting very briefly, or we're gonna maybe. I'm gonna switch my Wi-Fi because we are not getting a good signal. Options for the best. I don't know if that's gonna be better, so much nicer.
They didn't put super cool.
Questions?
In building appearance so that.
Can you hear us online now?
Yes.
No, it's for us, yeah.
We can hear you, but you're still frozen on the screen.
And when you.
All right, thank you. Sorry for that brief pause that was running so smoothly. And then we went to Q and A and. We're in the next, I think, difficult.
Blame John.
John, did you want to follow?
I'm happy with that.
Okay. You mentioned briefly that there are a variety of potential large load impacts. You focus mostly on data centers in your presentation. Can you speak a little bit about how you're thinking about the electrification goals and how those might impact the grid?
Yes, thank you. Good question. So before we even started looking at this data center activity in our forecast, we have for a couple of years been forecasting the effects of state policies for electrification. And that is actually where we see most of the forecasted demand growth. It's from EVs and heat pumps. And if you think about those two resources, our long-term forecast out 10 years shows probably about 10% growth over a decade. We've used some modeling based on data from the states around their EV and heat pump goals. And that really could drive a doubling of demand on the grid if you look as far out as 2050. So even before you look at large loads like data centers, we do see significant growth on the grid just from electrification. Now, I mentioned we do that forecast every year, so that gives us a chance to kind of do a refresh on what the state policies are. But we also look at things like registration from motor vehicle departments. And we found over the past few years that people are not actually buying electric vehicles as fast as the states had anticipated. So the growth has come down slightly for our forecast, but we are still predicting over time that we will see pretty significant growth as people transition to electric vehicles or plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. All of the details for that are included in the SELT report. If you're interested in those numbers or the numbers for New Hampshire, we certainly can make that available to you. Brendan, I'll ask you to take that up as a follow-up item.
Well, yep.
Yeah, thank you. Hey, good morning. I'm Curtis Register from Durham. My question is, so reading the chart here, it also mentions water factors and energy factors that are being in the planning for step up. With the planned or assumed step up of power on the grid to be around 1,000 gigawatts by 2040, how will that impact our water consumption for the New England? And is that going to impact how much more we have to import?
When you say water consumption, are you talking about cooling for data centers?
Correct.
Okay. So I mentioned earlier that if a power plant wants to supply power to the grid, they need to manage the fuel supply for their resource. When we look at things like large loads, we are looking only at the electrical interconnection to the system and how much power would be drawn from the grid. We don't have a process to look at the water consumption. That would fall under the jurisdiction of the states that oversee siting and permitting. ISO is not a regulator or a permitting authority. So it may be a factor, but it's not something under our control.
Thank you.
Morning, thanks for speaking to us. Quick question. Having to do with, is there a graphic, visual or set of graphics that can demonstrate that, say, last couple of fiscal years and into 2030, the contribution of sustainable energy as a measure of, as a percentage of the overall growth of supply? Is there a graphic that can show it's over 100 megawatts, arbitrarily 50% of the growth came from solar or from hydro or whatever? Is there a graphic that would show that?
Yes, it's not in this presentation, but you could actually see that in real time. On our website, we have a data portal that shows what the resource mix is, and it also breaks down the types of renewables, so you can see real-time operations. We also have historical data that shows what the resource mix has been from 2005 to 2025. So we can follow up and make that information available.
Okay. Building off of the previous question about energy demand, maybe water. So if I followed it right, that's not within your wheelhouse, the water demand and water consumption. So would I understand then that whole issue then becomes a local matter in terms of, like a site plan review and then looking at impacts on infrastructure like any other development? But that would be a local decision, local impact, et cetera. Is that correct? It would not be ISO?
Yes, that's correct. And we simply don't have the expertise to make decisions in that area. And it's not a responsibility that has been assigned to us by the FERC. So that would fall under either local or state jurisdiction.
Well, Don, do follow up to that. So when a data center is proposed before a community, goes before the planning board, this is for the DES guy too. Is the state regulators poised with a task force to step in and help the planning board go through the process, or we have to depend entirely upon the developer's information? Make sense?
Well, I would say you certainly should be coordinating with your counterparts at the state level in New Hampshire, either at DES or the Department of Energy in New Hampshire or the PUC. All of those agencies, I understand, to be following these issues. And that's probably where you'd want to get the state support from. I can't speak specifically to any task forces that might be in place for New Hampshire.
Thank you for that, DS guy.
We'll get to see them more.
Oh,
Well,
okay.
11%.
At 9:45, so we're, no, 9:40. We do have a couple minutes left for ISO questions. Colin?
Colin Lentz, staff. I'm wondering, just from, is there a difference in how you manage the power flow around the region between like a large single power plant and a whole bunch of solar, rooftop solar, or we have some pretty big solar installations that are coming online in our region. Does that change how power is managed in terms of the air traffic control metaphor you used?
Yes, it certainly does. So when we think about operating the power system, we use the term dispatch. We dispatch generation. We give them instructions when to come on and how much to produce onto the grid. Usually they're ramping up or ramping down, and when to go offline. And so historically, nuclear plants, gas plants, coal plants, oil plants, they've all followed dispatch instructions from the ISO. If you think about solar, most of the solar in New England is behind the meter. So we are not seeing that directly. There's no metering that gives us real-time information on the solar. We're able to gather data each day and do our models can kind of learn what the solar production was based on the weather conditions, and then that feeds into the planning for the future. But certainly having lots of solar on the system is taking demand off the grid, and it's really just shifting that demand. So if you have a cloudy day, it's still hot, that demand is then going to be served by the grid. So we have to be thinking about serving the customers in New England on a day when the solar would be operating and when the solar wouldn't be operating. So it certainly is changing the dynamics of how the grid operates. Now, the larger grid scale solar that's connected to the system, not the rooftop projects, those resources are metered directly, so we can see them producing power to the grid like any other large power plant. And I would just come back to the earlier conversation just to clarify, we are, as an organization, we're an independent, not-for-profit corporation regulated by the FERC, but we are not a government agency. So we work very closely with government officials, but we ourselves are not an agency.
That gets us to the end of our Q&A time. Thank you, Mr. Johnson.
Thank you for having us.
Next up is Steve Roy. He's the manager of the Hydrology Conservation Program at NPDES.
Steve, I'm to share here, and then I can give you the maps. So, is there a trick that you do?
Sorry.
What's the trick that you do? You use some and then presenting scenes.
Yeah, it should get,
Okay.
it's in PowerPoint.
Present. Oh, okay, so we'll be over there too. Okay. That how we play? Okay. Here, this way. Yeah. Yeah. Someone seen the presentation on it? Or does it take a second? Or just reading it. We should be good now. I think you're good. You're gonna do a mouse or you want a keyboard? You see ours?
Well, my name is Stephen Roy. I am the section manager of the hydrology and conservation section at New Hampshire DES. That's a section within our drinking water group underneath the water. And I'm here. We're not talking about types of permitting programs that largely can play the event that we get an application for an individual standalone site for a data center, be it a regular data center, a server-based data center, or an AI data center. We haven't had one of those, reflecting somewhat what was said previously. Not really a lot of sites that are rolling in the door at the agency. And talk about across a lot of program requirements here. I have touched bases with some of those permanent program managers. I know some of those programs very well. So I can see them. I'll have to submit for data center or standalone site. Whether or not there are data center applications seeds that are proposed to connect into utilities, we wouldn't necessarily know. About the site. We want to take.
Real quick, just one question. So this data center application, is that via the planning board, or does it come in around the planning board to you from the project sponsor?
Okay, so
I
most
don't know what it is.
standalone sites usually go to the towns first.
Okay.
Whether if it's in a city, town, or a village or a town
Right.
with infrastructure, then sometimes it goes to the local. Sometimes it goes to the state first for site. And then it goes to the town because it needs utility services like sewer.
So it's a standard application paperwork that,
No, it's not standard.
no, it's not.
Yeah. So,
Go ahead.
and just for clarification, I think most everyone here knows that there had been a conceptual application in Nottingham.
Twice.
There rose a lot, that generated a lot of, attention,
Okay.
and a lot of questions. And part of that was just, what do you do? How do you regulate, and what existing systems are in place to regulate data centers? For those of us in the land use universe, it's a new land use, and we don't normally see a new land use in our careers. So it's a lot of working and figuring things out. And so that was part of today, is just, I'm trying to understand what exists and what might we still need to figure out, in the future.
Sure. So on this slide, have an presentation of just providing what will likely be some permitting programs across the state that may be in play when a new site is proposed. Both from the design, development, and construction phase onto the ongoing operation phase for water and wastewater management and potentially related air discharge. So again, who I am, the hydrology and conservation section. I oversee numerous permitting programs. Predominantly the groundwater withdrawal permitting program, large groundwater withdrawal, community well siting, large and small bottled water storage permitting. Additionally, I oversee the groundwater discharge permitting, which is related to discharges associated with wastewater to the ground or groundwater safety. Approved numerous sources and discharge sites for some of the towns in Peter, Rochester, Farmington, Dover, and Durham. Both have groundwater withdrawal and discharge permits related to their municipal water systems. Additionally, I oversee the water conservation and water use registration and reporting program in the state. As well as I interface with surface water discharges and I draft permits issued by that program. I also lend a hand to the alteration of terrain program related to groundwater monitoring plans with impacts to private wells related to site development that includes blasting at AOT permit sites. So I do touch on a number of these programs and have touched bases again with program leads here. At this stage, no one really has an application for an AI data center. A couple of things I do want to emphasize and need to point out, whether or not any of these programs and permit programs apply and which ones apply is really highly dependent upon the site conditions and whether or not there are public utilities available, like city sewer, like city water. So you don't need a groundwater withdrawal permit if you've got city water, you need connection to the public water system. And I'll talk about what that is likely. Additionally, make sure both everybody gets this message, the front end and the back end here. These permitting processes are applied evenly to any user, regardless of the purpose that they use. AI data center looks just like a golf course, looks just like a nursery that grows hydroponic lettuce. Regardless of whether of the use, we don't need a subjective kind of determination on the propriety of use permit process. They all have to follow the same testing program in the groundwater withdrawal permitting world. If they propose a groundwater withdrawal that triggers the permit, they all have to do the same impact analysis, management of sediment transport offsite underneath the AOT program, regardless of the type of structure that goes on that property. So I want to emphasize that these are not programs that change the criteria based on the I'm just gonna run through the programs really quickly to make sure everybody fully understands what these programs obligate applications to. Alteration of terrain permit program is largely focused on land disturbance and changes in land grade. It applies to any site that proposes more than 100,000 square feet of land disturbance. If you're in the shoreline protection zone, 50,000 square feet. You have to put on record all of the design elements during construction and after construction that show how you manage stormwater and sheet flow across the site. The underground, or the underlying premise to this permit program is that you have to demonstrate that all of the stormwater that's infiltrating and managed on site prior to development is equal to all of the stormwater that's after development is equal to all the storm water that infiltrates in the ground prior to your land disturbance. So if you build a large, big block structure that occupies 80% of your site, you have to take that infiltration that would normally have happened prior to that structure and make sure it infiltrates on site through your design elements after disturbance. Some of those design elements, typically are retention and detention ponds, infiltration ponds, drainage swales, and AOT. Obviously, a very site-specific issue is whether or not you locate this property on an area with a lot of wetlands or next to a shoreline. Obviously, wetland impact, the premise in that program is that you minimize impacts to wetlands if you can on site. And the idea is you minimize the impacts to the habitats that wetland supports. Additionally, that set of rules also allows you to provide some sort of compensatory mitigation to wetland impacts. And there is a monetary compensatory mitigation program now called the ARM, the Aquatic Resource Mitigation Program, that big developments can put money into and impact the wetland on their site, but that money is redistributed in region to replace the feature that they do. So it's wetlands, shoreline, similarly, if you're within 250 feet of water body that's subject to the Shoreline Protection Act, you have to limit your impact to vegetative buffer around that feature so that nutrient retention and sediment retention occurs, and you have to minimize impacts to the shore. So again, the focal point being maintaining the habitat in and around the shoreline environment. It's tends to be a hot button issue in some sectors and some towns and cities. So you need a groundwater withdrawal, large groundwater withdrawal permit in the state if you propose the removal of 57,600 gallons per day or more. That's 40. In order to get that permit, it's a relatively long and somewhat substantial permitting process in this state relative to the other New England states. But you have to propose a monitoring and a testing program that monitors for the impacts of that withdrawal on water users in the area, water users being natural water resources and private and public waters. The site that was proposed, this concept discussion in Nottingham was previously a bottled water site that triggered a lot of local interest. Very familiar with that site, but it's got available water resources on site. But there is built into the permitting process, you need to assess impacts, implement mitigation for impacts if it occurs. Then ultimately a permit is issued that tracks the effects of that withdrawal over time, and reports those results to the state so that we understand if impacts occur, how the permit can be modified or adjusted. And it's normally contain environmental triggers that automatically kick in to reduce impacts. Likewise, there's a sister programs for surface water withdrawals. And it's by our water division and our watershed group. Similarly, there's a trigger requirement. You need a water quality certificate from the state if you're proposing removing more than 20,000 gallons a day from a surface water from the state. It's about 14 gallons per minute. Again, it's assessing impacts, but it really assesses impacts to the designated users of that service, the habitat needs. with the recreational utilities which are people. So that assessment backs into the minimum allowable withdrawal volumes you can have from that surface water feature. The permits usually are seasonal, they go up and down, based on the types of flow conditions in the river. And permits usually, like ground withdrawal permitting, work, spring withdrawal tax. Our discharge rules, if an AI center has their own need to discharge on their own site, they need to follow the discharge rules which say if you discharge more than 20,000 gallons per day on the ground or to the ground of wastewater, you need to get a discharge permit. It requires you to assess the impacts of loading wastewater to the ground at site, whether or not the water quality of that discharge water needs to be modified before discharge. And it establishes the monitoring network around the discharge zone with annual permitting, annual monitoring, and annual reporting. So that discharge permit program is another one that might come into play at the sites. Again, its sister is the surface water discharge program, which is not necessarily fully administered by the state. EPA NIPSEA's program has a role to play there. State of New Hampshire does not have primacy to issue these permits. We can redraft them when they change that size. Not those, like the surface water withdrawal program, assesses impacts to in-stream use. Amidst the impacts to those users, mainly treatment that surface water, that wastewater prior to disposal. A lot of the permits that have groundwater discharge permits for some of the cities and towns here, Rochester, Farmington, Dover. They are both groundwater discharge permit holders because of their online wastewater routines. They are mid-use permit holders because they all have outlet falls directly into the rivers that they do. The AI world, really only the large, hyperscale or giga scale AI data centers are largely built by surface water and have surface water withdrawal permits in the district. You don't have tons of those in states. Many of those are in the event that a site has access to public utilities, water and sewer, then many of these permitted programs, the AOT certainly applies, but groundwater withdrawal, surface water withdrawal, discharge, surface and groundwater don't apply. It's up to the discretion of the utility, but what they can service with their current infrastructure service capacity. And frequently those utilities, there are municipal utilities, they aren't yet necessarily under the requirements of the state's PUC, the special municipal exemption, the PUC state regs for municipalities, provided they manage their rates in certain ways. And in the case of AI data center moving into, let's say, an industrial park, Chester has an industrial park, and Dover has an industrial park. You know, that they would have to negotiate with the state utility, with the town and city utilities for rates and usage. Those utilities can establish use limits or restrictions or require infrastructure upgrades to be paid for by the user. So there's really an element of the local entity playing a role in water demand and wastewater management. And if the utility can't service the capacity demand from a large scale facility, it will need to develop additional capacity, either increase the surface water withdrawal if it's a surface water supply, water utility, or increase or add groundwater sources if it's a groundwater supply. So there might be a domino effect to the utility to develop capacity that would be linked to the groundwater withdrawal or surface water. Lastly, you know, these facilities sometimes are not small. Touching on their discharge rules here, I'm not as familiar with their discharge rules, but there are most definitely their discharge permits needed for power generation facilities. in or auxiliary boilers or emergency generators at some of these larger facilities because they absolutely need power. I think it's touched on in the ISO discussion, there is most definitely a nexus between energy and water at these facilities. They have to have water, manage heat loads at these facilities. So is water, that management system, cooling towers, chillers, circulator pumps, they all demand a significant energy load. So there's a link between the two. And cooling towers and such may need their discharge permits themselves. Usually the discharge permits require modeling of the air from particular matter management, things like that. So. Last but not least, there are other related programs I have not targeted. REPER program is becoming a real player at some AI facilities out west. REPER program manages the generation of hazardous waste. And these facilities do generate a substantial amount of electronic waste because they are largely chip factories. That's effectively, and as chips burn out, they need to be replaced. So they do generate waste associated with their operation. That is all managed by the states. It's a federal mandate. The septic system world is largely an issue with regard to operations and staffing of these facilities. They don't have city sewer connection. They're gonna need to get rid of some domestic wastewater. The smaller AI plants, which would probably be something that's on the scale of what's talked about in Nottingham. The staffing for a size plant that size could be between 10 and 50. So septic system. Water use registration and reporting program, anybody who uses more than 20,000 gallons a day, that is withdraws, discharge, or transfers more than 20,000 gallons of water a day, have to become a registered water user and manage their metered water use in the state every quarter for each month. About 880 registered water users in this state. And then the water conservation program plan is a program that mandates that facilities like these and other types of facilities demonstrate minimum water efficient water use standards. The water conservation plan is reviewed by the water conservation program, approved, inspected, monitored. So there are some related programs. If you really want to read lots about these programs, here are the primary websites for all.
Questions? What I take from your presentation is that all the resources and regulations cited in the first slide should be each community's land management regulations. I mean, they're there. They should, even Middleton has those on their site rec. So what DES is doing then, correct me, is that it's the responsibility of the community to enforce those regulations. You're not a data center resource. You already have resources that will protect the environment, not the concept, not what it does, the structure, right? Is that generally what DES does, right?
Word enforce is a big word. Attorney, land attorney, or a municipal. Towns enforce their building codes, subdivision, site plan regs. If an entity needs relief, they go to the city. Okay. If it's in your reg that their site plan regs, for instance, or subdivision regs that, you know, an applicant shall obtain a permit from the alteration of terrain program related to land development, and they don't get one, you can get on approval. It's not the role of the municipality to enforce the groundwater withdrawal permits or the surface water withdrawal permits, the elements of the AOT permit program. In fact, there are state Supreme Court decisions on some of those permit programs that flatly call out that towns are preempted from regulating those entities. The state's all.
That's right, that's what I meant. Yeah.
Let's go with Matt and Colin.
Hi, thank you for coming today. This is obviously an ongoing discussion over the next decade, I'm sure. My question is about groundwater mapping. What would you assess state state of completeness about groundwater mapping? So towns like Nottingham and in my case, Darrington, we actually understand what the groundwater looks like, capacity, size, boundaries, all that. Are we up to speed in your judgment, or is that a work in progress?
Well, I live in North, and so this region, is largely covered by a relatively thin veneer of till. About 16% of the state is river valleys that are filled with sand. And that's where most of the large groundwater withdrawals are for our municipality. Okay, or the golf courses that people love to golf on, or the school systems that our kids go to school. Now, as far as groundwater mapping, the geologic issue, geology is a natural process. We get most of our water in the state. Half of us get our water from a public water utility. The other half get our water from other wells. 90% of it's on federal wells. As far as groundwater mapping goes, there's no magic map associated with the state. There are regional maps. The current state of affairs is that the Geologic Survey has about 100% of the state's superficial deposits mapped. It also has groundwater data on it. Usually when these groundwater withdrawals are proposed, the very first part of the requirements is to develop a hydrogeologic conceptual model that requires an applicant to review all available information about groundwater resources in the region of the state and evaluate what the conceptual flow model for that region will likely be in their withdrawal. But there's no magic map to go to understand everything because the nature of federal groundwater flows through a fracture network really needs to be evaluated from a pumping test and monitoring network for that area.
Just a quick back. With the expectation that data center that wants to locate that they would conduct the groundwater mapping or issues with available, assuming there is actually something available?
They would have to submit an application. In fact, a licensed PG or PG firm, consulting firm would work. Usually the way it works is the consulting firm would work on their behalf, hired by them, go through the permitting process. Usually that's PGs and hydrogeologists that develop these conceptual models and propose monitoring networks and testing. And, they are licensed professionals. I am a PG myself. Their license speaks to their work. So their work has to be approved though by our program, by the groundwater withdrawal program before proceeding.
Colin, then. Wondering if the permitting process is accounting for the increased demand for, with data centers is a great example. The increased load on the water systems, the national water systems that are not being recharged. We still haven't recovered it last time I checked. So we can't just put water back in the ground magically. So is the permitting process adjusting for that increased demand?
If you look through the slides, so permit conditions routinely contain environmental triggers that require reductions in withdrawal volume for our big water users, effectively for our golf courses and nurseries that have these permits. When we move into a drought, it's a specified level of drought for a duration of time. They have to subsequently and incrementally start reducing the amount of water they use. They lost $2 million in turf about 10 years ago in 2010, 2012. because they're permit requirement.
Keeps me up at night. I don't know if it does you as well. Very concerned about how often we have drought, how we're going to adapt as we have more. We're doing a great job with having housing. I live in the town of Lee. We share water with Durham. We don't always have a lot of control of what Durham does, but we also will not have as much water as there's more water being used. What are your concerns? What do you wish we would do differently so we could address it?
Concerns is a big word. So being a hydrologist, geologist, I have spent some time out west, we're at school, working. We are fortunate in that we are in a water-rich part of the country. We get about a meter of rain per year, you know, and that is a subsequent huge amount of volume of water relative to other concerns. You know, my guess would be over time that AI data center issue, well, if the ISO folks are still on, will not be a water issue, water will not be the issue that is impacted the most by those data centers. It will be electricity. And I say that because if you spend any time looking hard at industry and what's available for information, there's technological adaptations that are already being rolled into some of these bigger AI data centers by the biggest players. You know, Meta, Google, Amazon, Google, the hyper and the giga scale facilities. Direct on-chip cooling, which is, think about most of these facilities they initially built, it was just air cooling, lots of air conditioning, air blowing over through the facility, through these radiator water coolers that pump the water up to chillers and then dump it into the ground. There's technological adaptation that get rid of air cooling and do direct on-chip cooling, which is like a little water jacket wrapped around every single chip. It's a more efficient way to cool. A lot less walls, less water.
Is that the closed loop system?
No, closed loop, something different. Closed loop geothermal wells are being deployed at a number of systems. There's Wyoming system, a state that's very receptive to data centers. Closed loop geothermal wells are being installed in some of these facilities that send the cooling water down through underground U-tubes, like an underground radiator in build wells, rock, because the thermal reservoir capacity of shallow earth is huge. It can absorb heat and offer it up. And that closed loop system can reduce demands at a facility like these facilities by anywhere between 50 and 80%. So that is a subsequent positive for the world of chip cooling. Some of these facilities. Additionally, there's a lot of manufacturers playing with submersible chips. So you'll walk into one of these data centers and it'll look like a big pool. All the servers and the boards will be water. Water will be slowly circulating through the facility. Again, that's kind of an off-brand direct contact method that will substantially reduce water. I think over time, you'll see is these technologies will allow these facilities to keep some cool. So recently Google has really marketed the fact that they've converted some of their existing facilities, instead of using virgin water, to using reclaimed treated wastewater from the local wastewater treatment. You know, obviously those are areas that are served by sewer. Purchase treated wastewater. So, you know, that we do have a couple of players like that in the state that are reclaiming wastewater in different parts of our data centers, but for other uses. We do have a substantial amount of very large closed loop geothermal well systems that stay already to hundreds to 1,000 wells. Our colleagues can bring entirely over geothermal with 3 huge closed loop geothermal well fields. City of Concord is building a school that's going to be 100 well closed loop geothermal well. People are migrating towards that technology to get off of fossil fuel running heat. So it's not, it is happening and will happen to this industry. But what it does do, it modifies the load, the electrical load, because those are electric pumps that we're static. Mark?
So I imagine that other states that are big into data centers, like the Mid-Atlantic states that were mentioned, or like California and Oregon, like all have their own processes, requirements, like what we've gone through here. So I guess what's different about New Hampshire's and like why are they still going through, even though they have such major site impacts in those states as well, like are they more robust, are there are more waivers granted at the others in the other states for these processes, or?
So, I don't really know. Again, it sounds like someone initially talked about the fact that, these are locations potentially are put in place in areas where large fiber optic information centers enter into the country. There are 4 or 5 big states that, like, Virginia, Arizona, Wyoming, and California, but not all of California, and Washington maybe. And there's a reason why it's on the coast. Some of these are on the coast, exception of Wyoming. I don't know. I know some of the Arizona facilities, I know the Wyoming facility, they are generating their own power outside the massive solar array. Some of the big facilities on the globe. One of the most sparsely populated states. These nodes across the country where the star might be just related to.
Possibility or trend might be offshore submerged data centers. How would the state be thinking about, if should that start to come to fruition? How would the state be thinking about permitting? What are the roles between local, state, and federal?
That's a complex kind of issue. Cape Wind is facing a lot of similar issues, Block Island around turbines. As you move farther offshore, it becomes more difficult. Gulf of Bing has a commission. Issues relevant to something. At the town level, federal level, at least for my town. If someone comes in and needs a variance, it goes in front of the zoning board and gets it in 5 minutes, then that is local law to the procedure. Going back in time in history, that facility in Nottingham, the prior proposal was bought for water, got a zoning board variance, the very first part of the front end of that project, under 4 minutes. So, the town was handed over to develop that site into farm. So that speaks to the town.
One question. So legislation seems to be the next step. Now that we've got the background of the grid and the water and hydrology side of it. This group already knows that water is my biggest bugaboo. You encouraged me with the new technology, with chip blankets and the closed loop and all the rest of it, using less water because, yeah, we may be water rich, but we're rich because of the water. And so we can't lose the entire economic driver of the state to support data centers necessarily. So legislation, town by town or region by region, county by county, whatever it is, state by state in some cases, seems to be the next step that we need to take.
I think what is clear at the federal level, current administration has absolutely said that they are not interested in regulating. Use the federal legislation to be out of the control of the AI sector, and are big advocates of it. This country playing a major role in AI data center development and remain those issues in the state. Yeah, we're telling people legislation is what's needed. Seems like some states are acting pretty quickly with banning legislation that puts in place bans, and those always are hard to. So, sure, legislation might be needed in this arena, but it's probably best done in a process that's well thought out, as opposed to very knee-jerky, very bannish.
I have a response to you as well. At the local level and regional level, so the NHARPC is looking into this matter and is doing research and coming out with some recommendations for all the RPCs. But in the meantime, if you're worried, the issues that are being talked about aren't limited to AI. Right? These are water usage issues, these are power consumption issues that would apply to any manufacturing site that comes into town, potentially. So if you don't have something in your ordinance that says, hey, if you use more than 20,000 gallons per day of water, you need to use some sort of or closed loop system or whatever, or extras guidance on how to properly manage that, then that's on you. That's what you should really be looking at. It's saying, how do we, at what point do we want to start putting in these conservation and enforcing these conservation mechanisms on the larger sites?
Hey, Jen, this Matt from Central. I just want to kind of piggyback off that. That was a really good comment. I'm working on, as we go, I'm actually sitting here marking up a draft ordinance now for one of my towns. And that's kind of approach we've taken, looking at the water recharge issues, looking at just industrial, right? Because it's that old zoning adage of like, targeting a specific use versus targeting the broader impact. And that's exactly what we're doing with part of it. I mean, sure, we're working on definitions for data centers, things like that, but that idea of looking broadly at, say, take the noise, industrial noise at property lines, right? Like that can be helpful. But I think I just agree with that idea of looking at industrial uses generally with water and air and things of that nature. So yeah, that hit a chord. Thank you.
Lindsay.
Yeah, as you think, for this discussion and presentations, I was thinking earlier when you were talking about the groundwater and surface water, the gallons per day thresholds, and I was just curious, and we can talk offline. I was curious if those thresholds were, if those are based on environmental factors or like what went into picking those thresholds, and then how that might help the region or the towns think about why thresholds were set, and then are there things unique to our own environment or reasoning to think about thresholds?
So the surface water withdrawal threshold is quite low to go. $7,600 gallons per day or 40 gallons per minute. That comes from an evaluation done by USGS in the mid-90s on sort of the median size new subdivision state across the state. Assuming 150 gallons per day bedroom 2.5. All the data from all the subdivisions built to the state, all small community water system subdivisions. 50 home subdivision with their 2 wells that service all 50 homes, that's a small community. You look at those types of projects and what those, some small middle size. Which is pretty low relative to the state's surroundings. Massachusetts has a permit for 100,000 gallons per day.
Okay.
6. In Rhode Island is pretty low, 10,000 gallons per day. It's so small, they don't have many water controls. And it's more or less a fill out the big forms, attach a check for $1,000, send it in. No testing. So the entry process, there's opportunities for the public staff, municipality to request hearings, oral and written testimony periods that send in comments about the permit, testing process, come back to that. So that is for public.
Thank you, appreciate it.
I just, Don used he has a unique way of making phrases. And this phrase of, we're rich because of the water is very true. Colin mentioned recent droughts. We've been kind of on the edge this year, but in the past, we've seen a lot of people that have their wells have run out. They've had to dig deeper. In a state where we depend upon tourism, both for winter and summer, people who rent cottages on lakes or on rivers, the ski industry that use water resources for making their own snow, and during winters when there's a drought. We don't get snow all the time in all parts of the state. I think what people are worried about is their livelihood. I'm not worried about the golf course. That's a luxury for people. It's a business. It's a hardship for the business, but for the average citizen, that's a luxury. It's recreation, of course it is. Same with skiing. But when somebody's well runs dry, that's a necessity that they're being denied. And it's not good enough to say the town will provide you with bottled water. That's a horrible situation when we get to that point. I just think that what people are worried about are corporations with lots of money pushing around their towns, pushing around them. And I think that was the case, and that was partly the response to the bottled water business that I'm really glad did not come here. That's what we're up against. And planning boards are up against that. You know, I've sat on my planning board for I don't know how many years now. And people always say, well, why did you approve that? Why did you approve this or that? They meet all the criteria. It's their property. Now, when they meet all the criteria, all the conditions, how do you say no? That's what people are worried about. That they don't have the financial resources to fight back. Because everything is centered around rules and regulations. And if you meet the rules and the regulations, it goes. That's the problem that I see with this. And I think it's a huge problem here in New Hampshire. Corporations coming in, pushing towns around, and winning. That's just my thought process on it. I don't know how you respond to even that. But what Don said just is so true. We're rich because of it. We don't want to give that up.
Certainly another question there.
There isn't. It's just my, that's why I said how you respond to it, because it's just my view in the big picture of things.
So reflecting some of the slides, permits do establish conditions. Most of those conditions are based on an impact evaluation for users and resources, water users and water resources. And those permits and permitting processes require mitigation of impacts if they are observed to occur, they observed after the storm slide. I don't, so that those permits apply to corporations, to individuals, like the individual who's talking about, you know, concept of maybe that structure on that property in Nottingham for an AI data center. So everybody has their perspectives on, you know, what individuals and municipalities can do against corporations. But the corporation also has to have a permit that meets the criteria, assesses impacts, and mitigates impacts. But you are right. I'm sure fortunate elements, just like a lot of the eastern Mississippi states, we get to use the water that crosses our property, it's on our property, below our property. West, you can't put 5-gallon bucket in the surface water in some states unless you purchase the right to do so. It is on that by whoever owns that water. It doesn't work here in eastern states. It doesn't, you don't have that type of water. Anybody who owns land has a use right to the groundwater development or a use right to the surface water that was given. Very few exceptions. There
was a question online from John Rod about, how does DES notify either SRPC or a town if a permit application has been submitted in our area or town of interest?
So I did touch base with a few people. I didn't know every permit program role when it comes to public comment. Some feedback. So the groundwater withdrawal permitting process, applicant, when they send in the very first application, have to send it to the municipalities in what's called study area via certified mail, return receipt, and they have to provide us those receipts showing the dates that these entities receive them. Those entities have 15 days, any of them have 15 days to request a hearing. We have to hold that hearing within 30 days in their municipality to get oral testimony on the application. And then we hold a 45-day written testimony after they close of that hearing. So it's a very involved process that notifies municipalities on the certified mail of the application. Not in order to the statute require or will require notification of any planning. Surface water withdrawal permit process, that's a 30-day online notice for anybody who can submit an application to a draft surface water withdrawal. Very few of the other permit programs I talked about, AOT, surface water discharge, NIPDs, very few of them have comment. It's the draft.
Just real quickly, can it be predicted where they're gonna wanna site these places, these data centers by the water and the land?
Again,
I mean, I'm sure they're looking.
what I've noticed. Couple of regional discussions and folks, so probably have caught some traffic about Westfield, Massachusetts. Westfield Air Force Base, much like Pease Air Force Base, former Air Force Base, now National Guard only. Most of that Air Force Base, like Pease, is an industrial park. And I've noticed some of these AI data centers discussed. Migrating towards some industrial.
Thank you.
Which feels like small towns in this state, how good nature of their town. Areas in their town are more important than other areas. Maybe the best landing spot for these data centers are in industrial parks, because people don't necessarily understand that.
Well, thank you, Mr. Roy.
Thank you.
So we can do a real quick, other business slash commissioner roundtable round, and then that will wrap up today's meeting. Ready to say goodbye?
It was just an idea to think about whether it's the planning commission or both of these presentations were very educational and enlightening. And I'm like scribbling notes and trying to think about like what to update my council on and like other. And did want to throw out the idea of definitely sharing, it sounds like sharing the slides and like a packaged email that would be really easy for us to forward to others in our communities. And or if the presenters might consider doing like a short recording that could be shared more, so you don't have to come to a million presentations, but just like a short recorded version of the slides that we could share with others.
We'll check how the audio quality is on the recording.
Oh, this was recorded.
Yeah, if it is okay, we can post it on our YouTube channel and have that available, but we have to see. How it came through, because we had a couple hiccups there.
Understood. But thank you, these are really.
Second by, all right, so Lindsay and Sarah, all in favor? Aye.
Gotta go.